Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And yeah, I know this might be a little bit late. Holiday weekend, other side projects, a few too many live streams. We all know the deal. But given that there are plenty of acts that might spark some controversy here, let's get on the pulse. So we got 10 albums on the docket. Let's first talk about, from Tiger's Jaw, I Won't Care How You Remember.
Your voice, now I can't get it out of my head. Way down and drag it under, heavy and burning.
Well, about time I got to this band. I've been hearing the name Tiger's Jaw since the breakthrough of the most recent wave of emo in the 2010s. They were one of the bands building out that sound earlier than most at the end of the 2000s. That meant that they never really caught the wave of buzz for the acts that came later unless you were in the know. And going through their catalog now, well, I kind of get why. Their early material was pretty solid, if a little lacking in explosive firepower, but then they signed to a major label, and half the band quit, and they even got Will Yip on production for their 2017 album, and I'm just not sure there was enough to salvage a project with even less punch that's now missing some of the ragged, subtle complexities in a lot of the arrangements. But okay, that was the first album with the new lineup. Maybe second time's the charm? Well, not really. Yeah, Will Yip's production keeps things very crisp and well balanced, and Tiger's Jaw has enough modern sheen to the lead melodies to help it sound pretty consistently pleasant and approachable. But my god, this might be some of the most toothless emo I have heard in some time. I think part of this is that our lead singers, they don't bring any sort of interplay or real intensity to the table, and the production isn't really designed to accentuate any vulnerability or intimacy or any sense of tension. And while I appreciate the occasional bit of bass growl or that snarled solo on Lemon Mouth, it doesn't really help any of the hooks pop out at me. And when you have this level of polish, isn't that what you want? And it doesn't really help matters when the writing doesn't have much in the way of detail or flair either, especially compared to the scene. I get making an album about aspiration and growth and moving beyond pain and trauma however you can when there's no easy answers, but a lot of the emotions and scenes that Tiger's Jaw paint feel very small. The emotions will curdle as relationships fail in slow motion, or the conflicts will simmer just out of frame with all too much overthinking, which really doesn't match the sort of production and compositions that feel way more immediate and in your face. What it reminds me of most is the sanitized, alternative adjacent brand of emo that broke alongside Jimmy Eat World in the late 90s and early 2000s. And I'm sorry, the few acts that I liked from this era had sharper writing and better hooks than this. Light 6 out of 10, there's an audience for it. I don't think I'm there. At least the album ends well. I'll give him that. Next up from Citizen, Life in Your Glass.
No, I keep on running, but it gets so tight.
So here's a weird thing. I heard the first singles from this Citizen album on Bandcamp. I was generally interested. I put them on my personal backlog, and then I discovered a lot of critics getting really excited about the album, and that got me curious to dig into their back catalog. And strangely, my expectations dropped considerably after going there. On their first three albums, you could really tell that Citizen was falling into a heavier, smokier brand of emo, with some post-punk and alt-rock elements, with some rather flagrant influences coming from brand new, but given that their second album was a complete dud for me, and I didn't love their other two projects before this, I had some serious worries about this new project that they self-produced, and, well, I remember why I liked the singles, because this is actually a considerable change-up for Citizen, and I'd argue that's a major positive. Not only did the guitars pick up more jagged distortion, but the bass grooves got much thicker and more sinuous, some oily synths slid in, and at least on a compositional level, the album is sliding much closer towards the dance punk side of new wave. Now, you could argue the band swapped out their brand new influences for The Strokes, Block Party, a bit of Silver Sun pickups, at least pulling from a very specific early 2000s post-punk revival tone, but it does help that Citizen isn't trying to be as cool as many of those bands were. The conflicted relationship songs are more raw and aggressive, where the melancholy of their previous albums is stretched into much rougher points of tension, with both partners in the relationships trying to choke back words that cut all too deeply. It's just a shame that the band can't keep up that momentum after the opening wallop of the first two songs. And while Call Your Bluff and Black and Red were some pretty solid efforts, in between the disgusting synths that are slathered all over fight beats, and now the album began to feel a little sterile, a little too heavily beholden to its influences, and how the writing begins to feel a little bit bereft of detail, and I'm left thinking in the background that La Dispute touched on a lot of very similar themes with way more visceral depth on Panorama. Alright, look, it's probably the most I've actually liked a Citizen album, and I do think this is pretty good. I get the hype, which is why I'm giving it a 7 out of 10, but man, I wish it went off just a little bit harder. That's all. Next up from Midnight Odyssey, Biolume Part 2, The Golden Orb. So we got a couple metal albums in a row this week, and this one's going to be a little bit tougher to talk about. A one-man Australian atmospheric black metal project that's been going on for about a decade that leans heavily on the doom elements, which unfortunately means that nearly every Midnight Odyssey album runs for about 2 hours. And I mean, they started off with some pretty potent textural experiences, even if I can argue that the grooves are really undercooked, to the surprise of nobody. But I wasn't really a fan of the vocals either, and I'm not sure there's just enough to the melodies consistently to really justify the length, even if you are leaning on some ambient tendencies. That being said, their 2015 album, Shards of Silver Fade, was probably pretty excellent, and while the first Biolume album probably leaned heavier on the synths than I would expect, it was also pretty damn good as well. So what do we get with this? Well, we got a Midnight Odyssey album, alright. But I'm not even sure in good conscience I would completely call this black metal. Now, to be fair, you could have heard evidence of this shift on the first Biolume, really going back for a couple of years now, with a lot of the riffs slowing down, less blast beats, but I would argue this is much closer to doom or even classic heavy metal, especially in the guitar tones, that arrangement, the analog synths, the more robust arranged folk and borderline symphonic elements, and with a lot of cleaner vocals. And I'm not at all sure it's for the better, because while it's a bit of a cliche that Midnight Odyssey albums, they run long, the reason that it's so noticeable here is because for as much atmosphere and consistent melodic motifs as this has, there's just not nearly as much dynamics or groove, with the drums sounding even thinner and flimsier than normal, especially the snares. And to be fair, I'm not sure there's enough in the content to really set it above either. Where the first Biolume album was focused on finding or creating one's own light in the darkest of spaces, they got a little cosmic there. This one is all about that sort of light that's searing, burning, purifying, and destroying in its heat and intensity. Not an uncommon metaphor, even beyond its mythological origins, and there's a Swans parallel here in more ways than one, even if I would say that there's a heavier lean here on ancient Greek mythology. But you know, I won't deny that it's kind of potent, especially looped into a loose story of an old primeval titan who cannot flee this primal force coming for him, framing a symbolic conflict between the old world and the eternal cycle driving in the new. But you know, leaning into that, there is a certain pomposity to this album where I'm just not at all convinced that the arrangements can bear the weight or sell the epic power of it all. I think the sun might wind up setting on this one, that's all I'm saying. So, strong 6 out of 10. I get it if this is your thing. I wasn't sold here. Next up from Mare Cognitum, Solar Paroxysm. So technically, I've already talked about Mare Cognitum once before, the slightly more accessible one-man atmospheric black metal act with a knack for spacier tones that teamed up with Spectral Lore for their behemoth split last year, where the songs were a shade bit stickier, even if he didn't quite experiment as much. So going into his solo releases over the 2010s, I found a lot that I really liked, in terms of sheer melodic swell and atmosphere, but I did find myself wishing the grooves might have been a bit stronger, or in a textural or content level that Mare Cognitum would take that next leap into true greatness that I heard snippets with Spectral Lore. And thus with this, okay, yeah, again, closer to the stuff I like, with huge gleaming melodies erupting across clouds of tremolo riffing and blast beats, where it's almost bright enough to obscure how the drums and grooves don't quite have the consistent texture or impact they really could. Even if the intensity really is there and the guitar solos are just insane, especially on Antaresian and Luminous Accretion. And that content suits the roaring intensity. In the face of a dying world, this is the moment where the album seeks to look beyond into the frigid brink to preserve some sort of knowledge, which is not an uncommon theme for a lot of space-themed metal, especially with environmentalist subtext. Until this project starts going into the category of what I like to call weird cosmic shit, featuring parallel universes, energy transformation into the birth of stars, and a lot of alien mutation into something more galactic and mind-melting, which by the end almost put me in the mind of the last Tomb Mold album, especially with a lot of the imagery. That being said, I would argue this is a more solid album than transcendent for me. The 5 tracks here, they're all very good, but rarely stellar or showcasing a level of dynamics to really give them a sense of scale. A little bit more sonic diversity couldn't hurt here. So, solid 7 out of 10. I enjoyed it, but it's a little shy of greatness. All I'm saying. Next up, from Death from Above, 1979, Is for Love. Let's slip back towards rock for a bit here, and this has been a band that's been on my docket to check out for a while now. A Canadian two-piece out of Toronto who exploded in the 2000s with a noisy, horny but whip-smart brand of hardcore dance punk with some insanely chunky riffs and a blunt howl that'd be ripped off wholesale by plenty of sneering rock acts to follow them. Now the funny thing is that after that explosive and critically acclaimed 2004 debut, the band seemingly broke up out of disinterest, and then they reformed a decade later to crank out more albums with roughly the same formula, and just some variance in the production. I mean, I get what they were trying to do to beef up the sound on Outrageous Now, but man, that project's missing its bite. I wanted to like that more than I did. Now, this is their 4th album overall, and, well, on the surface analysis, sure is another Death from Above 1979 album, and thankfully steered away from the chunkier approach on Outrageous Now, but something is still missing from recapturing the magic of their debut, and I'm not quite sure what it is. I think some of it might just be the mix placement of the percussion, which is a lot more programmed and prominent opposite the buzzy guitars that don't quite have that same fuller depth of tone. It just feels flatter, a little bit less dynamic, leaving a lot of the distorted vocals fighting for air against the fizzier drums and the drum machines, and the guitars that just feel a shade bit more sickly, which feels like a bit of an overcorrection off the burly crunch of their last album, and it almost feels like they're going too far. And hell, if anything, it feels like the drums are yanked from something closer to late 90s dance rock. And once you flip into that heady vibe, it does have some potent moments on cuts like 1+1, the mutated surf rock of Totally Wiped Out, exploring a parallel between getting lost at sea and lost online, and the NYC Power Elite 1-2 punch. Although that one might have more to do with taking the piss out of those who believe that their money might give them moral superiority, but also they're just like everyone else. Until the grisly moments when they have to face the brutal reality that we will all hit. But that undercurrent of romantic nihilism can't help but bleed into some of their political cuts like Glass Homes. And given where this album slows down considerably towards more filmy synths and even some keyboards, and why am I getting a mid-period Strokes vibe that feels increasingly limp here? Yeah, I appreciate a plea for more substance. I go on about that all the time. Find what's real outside of bad systems and re-examine a lot of half-formed history. But there's this dejected feel to Sebastian Granger's Muse-esque crooning by the very end that really can't pull itself out of the minor key murk, where it almost seems like they don't really believe things can change in what they're selling. Just kind of hits on such a sour note for the ending that it leaves me liking this a lot less than I really wanted to. And with this production, sorry, strong 6 out of 10. Man, for as much as there's some potent moments, as a whole, it feels like it undercuts itself. That's disappointing. Next up, from Xiu Xiu, Oh No. This might be the only Xiu Xiu record where it's possible for me to talk about it in shorter form, and you want a reason why, go check out my review of Girl with Basket of Fruit from 2019. This is an album of duets that might be some of Jamie Stewart's most accessible and tuneful work in a while. It's one of those cases where you can tell that Stewart is at least trying to meet many of his collaborators halfway, instead of fully dragging them directly into his mangled blur of a warped liquid abrasion. But I've often been of the opinion that this act's tuneful side can lead to some real structure and resonance to their transgressive edge, and as such, I was really pleasantly surprised how much I really liked this. Part of this I feel is linked to a shift in the themes, where so much of Xiu Xiu's previous albums just wallowed in transgressive nihilism, expecting the worst out of a lot of people, and knowing exactly how much you will tolerate before seeking the visceral exit. This is an album that still embraces all the swooning melodrama of these relationship scenes, but with some of the understanding of just how much everyone needs each other to really keep moving forward. And when you pair it with some nice self-referential touches to old Xiu Xiu material, it's an interesting bit of recontextualization that can rekindle some of the older romance I loved across albums like Fabulous Muscles. Now granted, said romance is shamelessly horny and kinky, but emphasis on shameless, because after so long being isolated and with all the evidence from old family trauma and the modern cruelties of the world that might come down on them, it feels less like it's provocation for its own sake and more just, let me have this. Let me have something real. Which is a bit of vulnerability that even seems to spoke Jamie Stewart a bit. Now granted, given that it is Xiu Xiu, some of the language and contorted composition choices, they're built for some messy ambiguity, which Stewart has outright admitted. The closing poem definitely springs to mind, as does all the nightmarish keening all over It Bothers Me All the Time, which was a bit much. But in this context of fractured, searching experimental pop, the taste does click better, and it also helps that many of these experiments just land way more effectively for me. The structure really does take that extra step. Part of this is the absolutely stunning production from Angela Hsu, Deerhoof's Greg Saunier, and avant-garde artist Lawrence English, who do a masterful job shaping the soundscapes that feel as climactic and percussive as they do, fractured and intimate. From the rickety classical shudders of The Grifters with Haley Four, or I Dream of Someone Else Entirely with Owen Pallett, to the somewhat dead-eyed gothic nightmares of Fuzz Gong Fight, or a cover of The Cure's 100 Years with Chelsea Wolfe. From the shambling haunt of A Classic Screw, to some of the kooky energy of the title track, or Rumpus Room with Angus Andrew of Liars, both of which have the exact sense of humor you would expect, even if I can't understand why they use the word rumpus. And again, with songs like I Cannot Resist with Drab Majesty, Saint Dymphna with Twin Shadow, Knockout with Alice Bag, and A Bottle of Rum with Liz Harris, we probably got some of the most earnest and straightforward pop songs that Xiu Xiu has ever made. And they've got this sort of ragged magic I could not help but really love. So yeah, I thought this wound up pretty great. Probably a more accessible version of Xiu Xiu than some of the diehard fans love, but you know, if you want looking for a jump-on point outside of Fabulous Muscles, yeah, 8 out of 10. Check this out. Next up from Evanescence, The Bitter Truth.
Whether you like it or not, you're gonna take what I got. If we can talk about it, then just keep trying.
Well, this has been long in coming, because for years now I've been dancing around the fact that growing up as a fan of symphonic metal in the 2000s, I have never liked Evanescence, and I'm still not a fan to this day. And I think some people are expecting a big rant from me, but the truth is way more simple. In an era where Nightwish, Epica, With Them Temptation, and a lot of their peers were assembling worldwide, in the United States and Canada, we were stuck with the watered-down, accessible version of symphonic metal, where not only did they not stack up with their peers in Europe, the albums have aged a lot worse than I was expecting. Yes, Amy Lee could really sing, they could occasionally structure a decent hook, and I'll say it, My Immortal is a pretty solid ballad, even despite the memes. But could they have had dynamic production worth two shits, or a single consistent album that rose to the level of at least Once or The Silent Force? Now, to be fair, if this was your gateway band into metal, I can't get angry at that, that's why they got hits. But there were better gateways that didn't have adequate US distribution, and Evanescence became a cliche alarmingly fast, not helped by the music just not having a lot of character to rise above it years later. So now, 9 years away from their last album of original material that had the great misfortune to be released the same year as The Unforgiving and Imaginarum, how's this new project? Well, okay. Credit to the band for taking themselves out of the symphonic metal conversation, because this project isn't even close to that. But that's not saying it's good at all. If anything, it reminds me of the overcompressed, programmed, percussion-heavy approach that Code Orange had from last year that was so metallic and sterile and buries any actual tune. And I'm not even surprised to see that Nick Raskulinecz is showing up as the producer yet again. Even some of the fans are angry about that. And look, I get trying to put forward a contemporary sound, but this is trend hopping of a different stripe, and it somehow comes across even worse. How does it flatter Amy Lee's vocals if she's buried halfway back, fighting against an ugly mix where the flat riffs and the glitch effects are clipping the mix, or you get that high frequency keening synth on the top of Wasted of You, and it has some painfully limited melodic support. This band's sense of dynamics, they were always terrible, but now they can't even get any swell to work with, and it doesn't help any of these hooks really stand out. Now, I will say the band did have a lot of trouble with their old label wind-up surrounding interference with the albums, not paying royalties, what you'd expect from labels, and I actually discovered a significant chunk of these songs were started way back around 2010 before getting axed from the self-titled album for not being good enough, and you get the impression that Amy Lee's been wanting to go in more of an electronically enhanced direction for a while now, given some of her work. But if you're doing that, why go for a producer that's gonna try to make you sound like Diet Code Orange, but worse? It doesn't accentuate your lyrical points about industry independence, which is the most frequent reference point on the album when you have this producer. And while we're on the lyrics, look, I'm not against hitting the rock bottom, facing harsh reality, asking hard questions of yourself, and then using that as inspiration to climb out of that. But you would think the poetry would have taken a few steps forward since Fallen to not feel so basic. Yes, I get the power of picking up so many women of modern rock and metal on Use Your Voice. It's probably one of the best songs on the album as a result, even if you can't make out individual voices. But even then, it is a song that operates in very broad strokes and doesn't have the interplay or novelty of a Paradise that Within Temptation cut with Tarja back in 2013. Either that or Far From Heaven, the ballad, they're probably the strongest moments. But isn't that ironic that the symphonic power ballad with the least overproduction winds up as one of the best songs here from an act that previously made symphonic metal? Look, I've made my peace with my frustration with Evanescence years ago, but even away from that, there's nothing to excuse the god-awful production and the writing that shows just how little this band has been allowed to evolve. I didn't even know it was possible for me to be disappointed with this album, but somehow I am. Go check out the new Epica instead, because this is a light 4 out of 10. Let's just move on. Next up from 24kGoldn, El Dorado.
I ain't tryna tell you what to do, but try to play cool. Baby, I ain't playing by your rules. Everything look better with a view.
I think going into this album, expectations had to be set. I wasn't expecting anything beyond disposable, sugary pop trap with a bunch of good hooks and questionable production, especially given that 24kGoldn's 2019 breakthrough EP comfortably in that territory. Hell, if I just got another Mood or a City of Angels, I'd probably be pleased. And here's the thing. I've heard a lot of trap over the past couple of years, and I won't deny that 24kGoldn makes some impressively empty flexing stuff on the pop side. The relationships are as disposable as the brand names, and yet bizarrely I found myself liking a lot more of this than I was expecting. A big part of it is that unlike so much of the dour, faux serious music in this lane, 24kGoldn actually seems like he's having fun reveling in the immature shallowness of it all, with enough self-awareness to be aware of some very real consequences can slip into the picture if he continues too long in this pipeline, but he's gonna have some fun while it's here. Violence isn't even part of the conversation. There's no gunplay, the hedonism is the point, and he's leaning into his natural charisma and knack for some surprisingly sticky melodies and hooks. It's the big reason why, despite being one of the biggest guest name features, Future should not be anywhere near this. It's also one of the reasons that 24kGoldn can hop onto the pop rock adjacent major chord structures and it sounds more natural for him. Even if you can absolutely tell he's trying to recapture the mood magic multiple times on songs like Coco with DaBaby, and they don't quite have the same magic, but there's a couple really good moments. But it does lead to the larger issue I have with this album. I get the content is disposable, but that does not mean so much of the production had to sound as budget as it does. The bass and the vocal mixing is slapdash and really inconsistent. The drum machines sound pretty cheap overall. And when you get moments that are trying to be a little bit more serious and honest, 24kGoldn cannot sell much of it. And the production's of no help whatsoever for him, even if Don't Sleep was a valiant enough effort. And yet, even with that, it's hard to ignore how some of the back and forth pissiness of the drama songs lose some of their luster in the back half of the album, where I'm left thinking that somehow Post Malone does this better, especially with a lot of the swamped out guitars. So no, it's not bad. I actually enjoyed this more than I thought I would, but 6 out of 10. Even then, might be being generous. Next up from Rod Wave, SoulFly.
I've been so zoned out, trying to figure out what's next. So scared to fail, I'm calculating my every step. Gotta watch my back and keep my scrap, but nonetheless.
So I've been behind Rod Wave as a breakthrough talent for a decent while now, which is one reason I really wanted this project to be at least an improvement over Pray for Love last year, that showed so much promise but had a lot of frustrating elements in the production and the song construction that prevented the potential from really blazing through. Now granted, going for 19 songs and nearly an hour of runtime had me kinda worried, especially if this could be going down the stream trolling route, but going through the album, it's the sort of project that shows some improvements around the edges, but not the big steps forward I was really hoping Rod Wave was gonna take. Yeah, the production is a lot better overall, although Pills and Bills and Richer with Polo G has some really rough bass mixing. In the latter case, I said it on Billboard Breakdown, it's exactly what you don't want with your only collaboration on the project, and I would argue that Rod Wave is bringing a little bit more detail courtesy of some of the sampling and some of the content. But you could also very easily argue he's just repeating the same formula over and over across this album. A guitar-driven melody that backs up his soulful delivery on songs that all feel a little bit undercooked when it comes to the structure. A second chorus or a bridge, they would add more dimension and detail to a lot of these, or at least help me think that some of these are more than just first drafts, and it probably should have been cut in half as a result just to feel a little less repetitive. Now granted, if there was more thought to a few of these songs, someone might have actually pointed out how wonky it feels for the samples on Don't Forget, which are again from the late Pimp C, and they aren't even original to be sampled in a song like this if you know the Benny the Butcher song that uses the exact same passage, but they're pleading for more content in hip-hop instead of flexing and violence, opposite songs that just go straight into that territory from Rod Wave, and leaves me thinking that he's starting to hit his limits across the board. When folks start complaining about social media, it's a sign that you start to run dry on ideas. I'm not going to deny that the baseline formula for me is still very agreeable, and Rod Wave has the charisma and presence to sell it, but the best moments are when he does a little bit more. I've already talked about Street Runner and Tombstone on Billboard Breakdown. They're the best songs, but I also did like the guitar rollick on All I Got and the swaggering hook of Invisible Scar. That was solid too. But beyond that, even though the tone is likable, for nearly an hour, it did get repetitive. 6 out of 10, just needs a little bit more. And finally, from AJR, OK Orchestra.
Can you know this song? Everybody come hang. Let's go out with a bang.
I know for a fact that a bunch of you were expecting that I would give this a solo review. Hell, for the views, probably would be worth it. But truth be told, as early as Neo Theater, I was exhausted with the AJR discourse, especially given how my issues with their sound and themes are pretty well documented. I was early to drive the bandwagon of rampant profanity-rich disgust. So naturally, the band actually had to go and get an actual hit with Bang, but if anything, that might be worse for them. Suddenly, any fragment of indie cred that was always a sham evaporated in the hot sun. And not only did they gain more than just the cult following, they also got the ire of plenty of other critics looking for an easy target. And I already gave all those critics the cliff notes on it twice over. And thus now, I'm just tired. I'm tired of the memes and the discourse and the fans who still want to engage with one of my ugliest reviews to date that I made when I was sick, both for the band and me, where I paradoxically swung around to hoping that this at least might not suck as much as the last two, and it doesn't. In fact, if I were to go out on a limb, I'd say this is AJR's best project to date, or at least one that shows a bit of long overdue progression and stabs at maturity that this band has been avoiding like the plague. That's not saying this is good. AJR remains one of the most shriekingly annoying bands operating today, where the production is always lopsided, incapable of groove. Very few of the instrumental tones have any sort of depth or warmth due to the frenetic overmixing to create the shoddiest of vaudeville theatricality. Everything about ordinary-ish people hurts me, especially the baffling presence of the Blue Man Group on it. And again, way too many chipmunk samples and bad falsetto. In fact, I'd argue the vocal mixing is all over the place on the album yet again. And you can tell with every creaking bit of experimentation, it probably should have been left on the cutting room floor, especially as this band remains the very, very poor man's John Bellion, who really needs to drop a great solo album so he can show up everyone who's ripping him off with so much regularity. But you know what? AJR is a band that's got some competence in song construction, and this is probably their most consistent album to date in that regard. Even if the production aesthetic of the project gives me a migraine, and their inclusion of any sort of gentrified hip-hop or jazz elements piss me off on a fundamental level, I can recognize better compositions when I hear them on songs like The Trick and World's Smallest Violin and Christmas in June, most of which are very much indebted to an older era pop, and some of the added strings that support them, they do it pretty well. Hell, and I'll say it, Adventure is out there with some of the vocal harmonies, and without Jack Met taking all of the leads, it almost kind of reminds me of a mid-2000s Bare Naked Ladies pastiche. That's gonna mean something, right? But you know what? What I think went missed when I reviewed The Click and Neo Theater were my biggest issues with AJR were always lyrical and thematic. The blinkered ignorance of their own privilege, the asinine pop culture references, the rampant shallowness, the commercial side of things, the denial of agency and their own growth and hackery. And make no mistake, a song like 3 O'Clock Thing show their meandering late night thoughts on politics and society. They are at best shallow and painfully undercooked. But to their credit, this album is the closest where they actually get to something a little more real. We're exposed to some of the roots of their stunted adolescence and their parents' separation, a desperation to please people who really don't matter in both their family and friends, a nascent Peter Pan complex that explains just how much and why they retreat to childlike language and framing, and the very slow steps they are trying to take to find some maturity, even if that's in a grayscale world for which they are very much not ready. But you know what? That desperation shows AJR confronting actual stakes for once. A song like The Trick hits the balance between earnest exuberance and just how much of it feels hollow when facing reality, and it gets to a core of something that the band has rarely been able to sell effectively. I'll give them points for that. So yes, the best moments of this album, they show growth. The problem is that whenever this band has tried to write around adult subject matter, both here and before, they're still very much playing in the kiddie pool. And the Arrested Development lyrical framing, where they share a very obvious parallel with Melanie Martinez, it still crashes into the uncanny valley about as hard as she often does. So even though this might be their best, strong 3 out of 10, I'm tired of talking about this group. Let's just move on. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I understand this is very long. Congratulations if you watched all of it. Why don't you subscribe? And because, hey, about half the people who don't, half the people who watch these videos are not. Try to hop on board this. I'm sure I said something that sparked discourse. Comments are down there. Have fun. Beyond that, though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my channels, potentially supporting it, join my Discord, maybe get albums that you want to hear on my schedule, well, link to my Patreon is right over there. Please don't feel obligated. Tough times out there for everybody, but the option's available. Until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.